At this stage, we have about 30 minutes to discuss another event that happened in our Yemeni case and that I mentioned earlier, the attack on the hospital. As a reminder, according to Amnesty International reports, on September 5, 2011, the Al-Razi Hospital, which second floor was used by Ansar al-Sharia for treating Israeli fighters, was hit allegedly by a government strike. And once again, for the purpose of this exercise, we will assume that the facts reported by Amnesty International are correct and that the attack took place in a non-international armed conflict. Our goal here is to discuss the legality of the attack by the Yemeni authority against the Al-Razi Hospital in order to exchange more generally on IHR rules on the conduct of hostilities. So we will really investigate the different steps we need to go through when analyzing the legality of an attack under international humanitarian law. So I'm asking my first question to students' representatives, and please let me know who wants to take the floor. The question is the following: is a hospital a legitimate target under international humanitarian law, or could it become a legitimate target? Is this sufficient, for instance, for an armed group to use a hospital to treat wounded fighters, as we observed in the case we are concerned with today?
So, thank you. So under IHL, hospitals or medical units are protected against attacks. The only exception to that special protection is if they are used to commit hostile acts. And hostile acts are defined in the commentary to the Geneva Conventions, and the only, for example, they say that shielding combatants in an hospital is sufficient as an hostile act. However, to deprive an hospital from this special protection, there is an obligatory warning and a due delay must be given for the hospital authorities to prepare to change their functions or to evacuate the wounded and sick if needed. And then the obligation of proportionality and precaution still apply.
Thank you, Camille. I've heard that Rita want to take the floor on this issue as well. Rita, do you have something to add on the legitimate target?
Well, as a whole, I think that in this particular case, the hospital was not a legitimate military target because, as a fact state, it is not clear that it was used for a military purpose outside its humanitarian mission. Therefore, I think in the case it was not a legitimate military target.
Thank you, Rita. Maybe still on this question of the legitimate target, I would like to hear Ken Hume. Could you provide a concrete example of what would and would not be an act transforming a hospital into a military target?
Yeah, thanks, Djemila. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think already the legal advisor has really set it out quite well. Basically, any military operation that is being conducted in or through a hospital that doesn't relate to the legitimate duty to protect the wounded and sick would potentially make it lose its protected status. For example, if it is being used as a command and control center, if the opposition's command structure is using that second floor to direct operations, if there are weapons stored there, if it is being used for military briefings, any of those sorts of things would make it lose its, potentially make it lose its protected status, even though there's not actually conducting an attack, if you like. So I think that's very important to stress. The other thing that I wanted to stress is clearly it would only lose its protection after a warning and a time limit has elapsed and nothing has been done. But I think the last speaker mentioned that they felt in this case that it hadn't lost its protection because on the basis of what was known publicly it was not being used for military operations. I think it's important to distinguish between what is known as a public fact, and therefore might have been available to Amnesty International, and what is known through military intelligence. And in this case, we don't know. We don't know what the military intelligence was. We don't know whether it was corroboration that it was being used for military purposes. So I think we always have to bear that in mind when making a judgment. But I mean, subject to what you want, I can speak later on perhaps on some of the targeting procedures and the process and the need for positive identification that it is being used for military purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the warning, because it was my following question. So I think we can perhaps now talk about proportionality and precaution, because everybody seems to be really interested in this particular question. So my first question is for the students' representative. Could anyone explain to us to what extent do the general principle of proportionality apply to attack against a hospital in the event that its protection has ceased? Or how does this principle work? And according to you and to the facts that were reported by Amnesty International, do you think that there was a violation of this principle in the present case? Who wants to take the floor? So, Leon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. This is not Leon, however. It's Lele Chiruto from the University of Nairobi. Under the principle of proportionality, to what extent that applies to the current situation, Rule 14 of the Rule 14 of customary international humanitarian law states that launching an attack which would have an expected loss of civilian life or injury to civilians or to civilian objects or a combination of which would be excessive to the direct military advantage expected would be prohibited. So the same would apply to this case, that even though the hospital were to lose its protection, the expected military advantage and the incidental civilian loss should be proportional. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to follow up on this and also on another point regarding the assessment of proportionality more concretely, and I will come back to Ken on this particular issue in a few minutes. But before that, I would like to ask a question, a technical question maybe, to Françoise and also to Alexander. In assessing proportionality, how do we consider expected incidental damages to military medical staff and objects? Do the parties to the conflict have to take into account expected incidental damages to military medical staff, transport, and objects in the proportionality assessment? Who wants to react on this? Maybe firstly Alexander and then Françoise. Alexander?
Thank you very much, Djemila, for this very interesting question indeed. I mean, it leads us actually back to some of the fundamental treaty texts, and notably to Additional Protocol 1, which also for our purposes constitutes customary international humanitarian law. And there you will only explicitly see that the excessive expected incidental civilian harm must be considered in relation to concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So at first sight, on the basis of that omission, you might somehow argue that military medical facilities, transports, or military medical personnel would not benefit from these principles of proportionality, as well as the principle of precautions. However, we of course need to be simply aware, and this has been stressed, that you know, it would be counterintuitive to actually consider that also military medical personnel and objects are specifically protected. So this would imply that they would have some elevated level of protection from civilian objects or civilians, and then at the same time say that they would not benefit from the principle of proportionality and the principle of precautions. The second thing, and this has been repeatedly underlined today, this fundamental obligation to respect and protect both civilian and military medical personnel and objects, and to do that in all circumstances. So this suggests really a very stringent character of that obligation. So also on that basis, it would be strange not to consider the principle of proportionality and in this respect. And finally, also a number of states in their military manuals do explicitly say that the principles of proportionality and precautions also apply to specifically protected objects and persons, and also the leading ICRC and Bouchet-Saulnier commentaries take that view. So on that basis, at least for us in the ICRC, it's quite clear that generally these military medical personnel, facilities and transports must also benefit, of course, from the principles of proportionality and precautions. Back to you, Djemila.
Thank you, Alexander, for your very clear answer, at least from the ICRC point of view. Now I would like to give the floor to Adriana, who wants to react on what was just said. Adriana, you have the floor.
Yes, I would like to talk about how these principles were respected or not in this case.
Okay, great.
Prima facie, it appears that this airstrike would have been an indiscriminated attack because of the potential number of incidental victims that an airstrike may cause in a city. As an alternative to this airstrike, the Yemeni armed forces should have considered a ground attack, which could have allowed them to target only the fighters not rendered out of combat. However, I want to highlight that at this point it is not possible with the information available to assess the compliance of these principles because it is necessary to obtain further information on. With respect to the proportionality requirements, what was the military objective that they were after and its importance for the overall military campaign. For example, if in the hospital was present a high-ranking member of the armed group, and also what type of aircraft was used to assess how accurate can it be. And with respect to the precautionary requirements, it is also important to know the surrounding circumstances to determine what additional measures were feasible at the time, such as the time and urgency constraints when they were planning and carrying out the military operations. Also, we need to know what precautionary measures took the Yemeni armed forces at the time, intelligence, surveillance, etc. And finally, it is important to know the military capabilities of the Yemeni armed forces. I also would like to highlight that it's important to take into account that since this airstrike was directed to an object located in a city, which is by definition a densely populated area, there is a higher threshold on what reasonable precautionary measures are expected because of the effects that an attack might produce for the civilian population. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I think we already moved to the precaution topic with your answer. But before that, I really would like to hear Ken on the principle of proportionality, and then we will go back to precautions. But Ken, could you provide us maybe with examples from your practice on what are the concrete difficulties in assessing proportionality regarding attacks on hospital?
Yeah, thanks, Djemila. It's a really interesting question, and some great points have been raised actually in the discussion. Clearly, the first thing you're into is assessing, as somebody said, whether it's militarily necessary to achieve your mission to strike that hospital which has now lost its protected status. The proportionality assessment is extremely hard, and there is no simple equation to do that. You have to factor in a number of things. You have to factor in the value of the target. Somebody's mentioned it's a high-ranking leader, perhaps. That would then become an HVT, a high-value target. You must look at the locations of civilians in the surrounding area and other protected individuals. And then you need to do a predicted battle damage assessment. In other words, how much incidental damage are you going to cause, dependent on the means and methods which you use to strike. And that is not an easy equation to do, and it must be done on the basis of the intelligence that the military has available to it at the time, and we very often tend to judge after the fact when everything is known and clear. Just in terms of means and methods in respect to proportionality, though, a couple of quick comments. Airstrike. Airstrike is actually a relatively precise means of hitting a target, much more precise, for example, than artillery, which is clearly an area weapon. It's not a point weapon. You can't hit a point target with it. And actually ground attack, be very careful when one recommends this. Ground attack is usually very costly in terms of casualties. It involves fighting your way into an area and into an objective, and I suspect the casualties in the surrounding area might have been much higher had that taken place. Finally, on the sort of airstrikes means and methods, clearly angle, timing of attack are all factors which you can use in your proportionality assessment, and indeed as a means of precaution, the other key principle here in further reducing civilian casualties. You can adjust the warhead on a sophisticated weapon used for airstrike to mean that actually the explosion will only affect one level of a particular building. You can increase it to mean it'll take 2 levels, or a full charge, if you like, that it will take the whole building down. But I think, as somebody said very rightly, it depends on the military capability of the armed forces concerned. And in this particular case, clearly, I doubt that was available to the Yemenis. So that's not an excuse to avoid the obligations, which are absolute, but we must take this into account when we're assessing their conduct. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. I think we've, as I said before, already moved to the precaution principle. I know that I see that some people want to react on what have just been said. I will give the floor first to Rita and then to Camille. So Rita, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to point out that in the facts that the case has given us, there were civilians being taken care in the first floor. Therefore, I think this has, even if the armed group had the control of the second floor, this was a point that had to be taken care of in the assessment of the principle of precaution. I think also that an airstrike can, taking in consideration that the military capabilities of the Yemeni armed forces can be more destructive and more damaging to the civilians that were being attended in the first floor, and also international humanitarian law establishes the obligation to do everything feasible to assess whether the attack may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, or a combination of them. So I think that with the facts that we have in the case, and since we do not have the information, the intelligence information that the military have, I think that it can be described as that it did not take in consideration correctly the principle of precaution. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, now Camille, do you have something to add on this?
Yes, I do. So I would like to recall that there is an obligation on both sides during an armed conflict to protect medical units, wounded and sick, and medical personnel. So under precautions, there are also passive precautions. The medical authorities in particular have an obligation to make sure the hospital is used solely for medical purposes. Additionally, an active precaution made by the attackers, as my colleague from the Geneva Academy said, there's also they also have to get as much information as possible before to attack, to know in particular if the activities carried out by the armed group in the hospital are are hostile acts or not.
Thank you, Camille. So we are almost running out of time, but on those two questions of proportionality and precautions, I would like to hear maybe what Alexander has to say about what was said by Ken Hume and by the various students, and then we will already have to wrap up. So Alexander, you have a few minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Djemila. And I think Ken already put it much better in military terms than I could ever put it. But I think one aspect to be underlined, and what makes really finding evaluation of proportionality so difficult, is actually the kind of perspective that you have to evaluate it against. And this is at the time the attack was conducted, you have to put yourself in the position of the military commanders. And so it's hard actually for someone else actually assessing whether violation of this principle has occurred to have that kind of information. As was pointed out in many cases, this is also subject to military intelligence. So for us in practice, this is very difficult to actually build a persuasive case on the basis of the principle of proportionality. It's a bit easier, I would say, in terms of precautions, and this we would favor, because here you can perhaps argue that from then the damage that was inflicted and also by numbers of casualties and so on, whether everything feasible was conducted in the circumstances. So there, if there is a significant number of casualties there might be a prima facie case that perhaps not everything feasible was conducted. And then I found Camille's comment also very interesting and pertinent in terms of recalling passive precautions also of the defender. And I think this ties in also with respect of the issue of misusing the hospital for military purposes. We also have to be aware here in this regard that in the obligation to protect a hospital, there are active measures must be taken to enable medical facilities to perform their functions, but also to ensure that it is effectively respected by others. And this would entail that possible measures are undertaken to avoid that military activities are undertaken inside the hospital. So this can be argued in terms of the general obligation to protect hospitals, but also under the more general rules on the conduct of hostilities that we've been discussing now. So thanks, and back to you, Djemila.
Thank you, Alexander. I think, unfortunately, we already need to wrap up. I think today we have learned a lot, at least I learned a lot, on the protection of the medical mission under international humanitarian law. We were able to underline areas where there is a large consensus, and at the other end, I think we have also highlighted some controversies, notably concerning precautions and proportionality. Another element that was pointed out mainly by Ken Hume's expertise was the concrete difficulties that states, armed forces and armed groups face when applying humanitarian law rules on the ground, and this is in particular concerning, of course, the principle of proportionality. I would like to thank all the people who participate to this event, and also all the students who are behind the students' representative, and this is important. It was for me a real pleasure to moderate this event.